Hello everyone. In this video I'm going to be talking about the structure of what we know as the cell membrane and why people refer to it in terms of the fluid mosaic model. Now the cell membrane is also called the plasma membrane, and in certain instances you see it being called the plasma lemma. But for this video we'll just refer to it as cell membrane. Now the cell membrane as a whole is a crucial structure for a cell. It controls what comes in and what comes out of the cell. It controls the substances that the cell will take in and take out. And it's not just around, if you think of a basic animal cell, it's not just around the outside surrounding the cytoplasm, but all of the organelles you find, so the Golgi, the lysosomes, endoplasmic reticulum, they are all membrane-bound organelles, so they have this structure too. So let's start first of all. Here is just a diagrammatic representation of a cell membrane. And I'm going to go through each part and then say at the end why they are there, essentially what their function is. So let's start with this yellow molecule that you can see. Now this one here is what we call a phospholipid. Now you'll notice that it's a yellow dot with two blue lines. So this yellow dot represents a hydrophilic, a water-loving head, and the two blue lines represent a hydrophobic tail, a water-hating tail that points inwards. Now you can see that we have one layer of phospholipid here, a second layer here, so this forms a bilayer. So we say that the cell membrane has a phospholipid bilayer. So we've put the phospholipids in place. Let's add, in fact, a little something to this diagram, something that's not on here. So what we're going to do is just put in a few little green dots. Not the best diagram, but we'll just put a few in, just so that I can label it and explain why I'm putting these in. So we'll have one there. Let's have a final one just down here. Now these green dots that I've just added, these are cholesterol. Now cholesterol plays a vital role in the cell membrane, which we'll talk about in a moment. Okay, so now we've put the cholesterol in place, let's think about what these big red balls seem to be. So we can see we've got a few of these red ones just on the outside of this membrane, so not spanning the whole membrane like this one here, just on the outside. And because they're just on the outside, these are called extrinsic proteins. So we have one big extrinsic protein shown just where I'm labelling. We've got another one just over here, another one over here. So they're extrinsic proteins, clearly quite different to the one that you can see spanning the whole width of the membrane. Now that one there would therefore be an intrinsic protein. That's an intrinsic protein, one that goes within, across the whole of the cell membrane. So we've put our intrinsic and extrinsic proteins in place, we've put our phospholipid molecules in place, cholesterol. Now we've just got these what look like Y-shaped blue structures. Now these are sugars that start with the name glyco, and then depending on what they're joined to will give its full name. So these blue ones here, these blue molecules attached to those proteins are what we refer to as glycoprotein. So we have a glycoprotein here, and we've got a glycoprotein up at the top here. So you might be able to guess that if this blue molecule, this sugar, were joined to one of the yellow dots as we have, and I'll just circle it in red here, then that would be a glycolipid. So glycoprotein, when that molecule is attached to a protein, and glycolipid when it's attached to one of the phospholipid molecules. Let's think about what these parts actually do. So the phospholipid, let's start with the phospholipid, we'll go around. So structure 1, the phospholipid. Phospholipids allow lipid-soluble substances to enter and leave the cell. By lipid-soluble, that means it can dissolve within the lipid. So we're thinking very small molecules, maybe non-charged molecules, or even just lipid itself. Lipid-soluble substances can go through that phospholipid bilayer. By having the hydrophobic tails pointing in, it can also prevent water-soluble substances entering and leaving the cell, so it gives it that element of control. And these phospholipids help to make the membrane flexible. Next, let's think about these extrinsic proteins. Those extrinsic proteins help to give the cell membrane mechanical support and strength, but moreover, they act as what are called cell receptors for molecules like hormones, especially when we have carbohydrate attached or glycogen, like we see with this glycoprotein. So these extrinsic proteins give mechanical support, and with the attached glycoprotein can act as receptors. So now let's think about these intrinsic proteins down here at the bottom that I've labelled. Intrinsic proteins act as carriers to transport water-soluble material. So anything that can't naturally just pass straight through, and I'll draw it just in purple. So if you have a lipid-soluble molecule, it could potentially just pass straight through this lipid bilayer, as I've shown by this purpley pink arrow. But if it isn't lipid-soluble, then it would, in effect, have to take a different route, and it would probably make use of this intrinsic protein to come through. So intrinsic proteins act as carriers to transport water-soluble material. They also form recognition sites for identifying cells when carbohydrate is attached. So you can also have carbohydrate attached to these intrinsic proteins. Again, they'll be called glycoproteins that can act as recognition sites or receptors. And those intrinsic proteins also help to adhere cells together. Now, the last thing to consider is this, cholesterol. You may think, why would we have cholesterol in our cell membrane? It adds strength. And that's why we have cholesterol, for structural support and strength. It strengthens our cell membrane. It has to be a firm boundary to that cell. So that's why we have these little green molecules that I've drawn. That's why we have cholesterol, to help add strength to our membrane. So let's finish just by thinking about the term fluid mosaic model. Because when we think about the fluid mosaic model and we describe the membrane as being such, we need to think about where each of those words comes from. So fluid comes from the fluidity that phospholipids have. They can move past and slide past one another. In fact, if you were to take just this section of membrane that I've drawn on this slide, seconds later, if you were to look at the same thing in a real life cell, it would be a completely different setup. Cholesterol would have moved, the extrinsic proteins would have moved. Because the phospholipids can move past one another, they give it a fluidity, hence where the name fluid comes from. Mosaic is because if you were to imagine rubbing your hand on the top surface of this picture, it would feel quite bumpy. It's not a flat, smooth surface. You've got, if you just follow my pen here, so you've got this glycoprotein, you've got this piece of cholesterol, then you've got this extrinsic protein, for example, then an intrinsic. You can see it's not a smooth surface. So that's where the term mosaic comes from. So we've explained fluid mosaic, but model. The word model is used because this is simply just a diagrammatic representation of what we believe the cell membrane to be like. So that's why it's a model, it's a diagram to represent our current understanding of it. So this is a video talking about the structure of the cell membrane, also known as the plasma membrane, the parts you find, or the components in the cell membrane, what they do, and why we use the term fluid mosaic model to describe it. Okay, hope all that helps.